So how did we get here? How did the world find itself on the brink of a major war? To really get what's happening right now, we've got to go back. We need to look at the cracks that were forming in the foundation long before things exploded.
And so it has begun. Just, wow. Those 4 words, right? That's what flashed across news screens everywhere. It was the confirmation of everyone's worst fears. A new and really dangerous chapter was starting.
Okay, so let's set the scene. February 28, 2026. The world basically wakes up to red alerts flashing everywhere. All those tensions that have been simmering for so long in the Middle East, they didn't just simmer, they boiled over.
And things move fast. I mean breathtakingly fast. First, you get these reports. Loud blasts over Tehran. Then bam, Iran shuts down its airspace. A little later, air raid sirens are wailing across Israel. And then, the big one. The announcement from the White House that changes everything.
And President Trump, well, he did not mince words. He came out and said it plain as day. We are going to raze their missile industry to the ground. It will be totally, again, obliterated. I mean, that's about as direct as it gets. The goal wasn't just to send a message. It was to completely dismantle their capabilities. So you have to ask, right? How on earth did we get to this point? Because something this big doesn't just happen overnight. It's not like a switch was flipped. To really understand the explosion, we've got to look at the slow burn that came before it.
And that slow burn really starts in 2025. You could say the stage was being set. The whole global outlook back then was, well, hazy is a good word for it. The world was already juggling a whole bunch of really serious, interconnected problems.
You know it's serious when the IMF starts using dramatic language. And they did. They basically said the global economy was trying to navigate extraordinarily uncertain times. And let's be clear, that's not code for a little blip. It was a sign of some deep, global anxiety about where things were headed.
And this is where it gets really dicey. It wasn't just one thing. You had slowing growth, then you pile on new trade tariffs, which created all this tension, and on top of that, inflation just wouldn't go away in a lot of major economies. It was like building a house of cards. The whole global system was becoming super fragile, ready to topple with just one push.
Okay, so let's zoom in from that global picture to the Middle East itself. Because all that fragility we just talked about, it was even worse there. The region was splitting into a story of the haves and the have-nots, creating these massive economic fault lines.
And you can really see the split right here. On one side, you've got the big oil exporters. They're doing great, right? Pouring money into new industries, foreign investment is flowing in. But then you look at their neighbors, the oil importers, and it's a totally different story. They're getting hammered by conflicts, rising debt, just struggling to stay afloat. It's like 2 different worlds in the same region.
And that boom was no joke. I mean, just look at something like airlines. By the time we're heading into 2026, the most profitable airlines in the world were coming from the Middle East. That's a huge symbol of where all the money and economic muscle was. But then you see this, and it's a stark contrast. Countries like Egypt and Jordan, their public debt was nearly as big as their entire economy. Think about that, around 90% of GDP. And that's not just some abstract number. It means their governments were totally strapped for cash. If a crisis hit, like a spike in food or fuel prices, they had no safety net, no room to maneuver. It made them incredibly vulnerable.
So you've got this economic fragility, right? Well, at the exact same time, another massive problem was taking root, out on the seas. By 2025, the constant attacks on global shipping weren't really a crisis anymore. They were just the dangerous new normal. 737 days. Let that sink in. That's more than 2 years that the conflict in the Red Sea had been disrupting global shipping. This wasn't a temporary problem. It was a long, sustained issue that forced the entire shipping world to change how it did business.
And here's the really crucial part. The threat wasn't static. It was evolving. At first, the attacks were pretty basic, maybe a single missile here and there. But then, they got way more sophisticated. We're talking coordinated strikes with drones, missiles, even unmanned boats. So while the attacks might have happened a little less often, when they did, they were much, much more severe.
And to make things even murkier, you had this thing called the shadow fleet popping up. Basically, these are ships that operate off the books. No Western insurance, often carrying sanctions stuff like oil. They were a total wild card. How do you manage risk when you have this huge, invisible fleet of ships doing who knows what?
And look, this wasn't just a Red Sea problem. The world's oceans were becoming a pretty dangerous place. The Black Sea was literally a war zone. You had pirates coming back off the coast of Somalia. The Persian Gulf was always a tinderbox.
And then you had these new undetectable mines showing up. The entire global supply chain was stretched to its breaking point.
All right, so let's bring it all back to where we started. February 2026. Now that we have this whole picture, this shaky global economy, and these super risky shipping lanes, it starts to make sense why the attack that day sent such a massive shockwave around the world.
Yeah, this wasn't a spark in a vacuum. It was a spark landing in a global powder keg. The world was already fractured, already fragile. So all those problems we just talked about, they acted like a giant amplifier, turning what could have been a regional fight into a full-blown global crisis, like instantly.
And you can see the fallout right away. Experts were immediately sounding the alarm on a bunch of things. First, direct retaliation on US and Israeli assets. High risk. Then, the activation of proxies like Hezbollah. Again, high risk. And the big one, the chance that the Strait of Hormuz, which is, a critical artery for global oil, could be shut down. That would trigger a massive shock to the entire global energy market.
So that economic haze the IMF talked about back in 2025, it's not hazy anymore. It's the thick fog of war. All those slow-burning risks we've walked through, the debt, the shipping lanes, that was all the fuel. The military strikes on February 28th, that was the spark. Which leaves us with the one terrifying question. When the ground is already this unstable, what in the world happens next?